Okay, let's dive right in. We all know there's just a flood of information out there every single day. Trying to find the stuff that, actually matters, it can feel pretty overwhelming.
It really can. Like trying to find a needle in a haystack sometimes.
Exactly. So today we've got this stack of sources, and they're surprisingly varied. We're talking cutting edge cancer treatments, but also global politics, recycling old phones, even literary translation. Quite a mix.
It is, and that's the goal, right? To sift through all this, pull out the really important bits, maybe connect a few dots you wouldn't normally connect, and basically give you a shortcut to being, well, informed.
A shortcut. I like that. So we'll touch on science, tech, world affairs, social issues, even literature. We're going to unpack this stack together. Where should we start?
Let's kick off with science, specifically a real potential game changer in medicine. Our first source covers a new approach to proton therapy for cancer. It's called Step and Shoot SPArc.
SPArc, spot scanning proton arc therapy. Okay. And what grabbed me immediately was its application for those really tricky cancers, the ones hard to reach without damaging vital stuff nearby.
Exactly. The article highlights a specific case, a 46-year-old woman. She had parotid gland cancer, and it had spread along her facial nerve, heading towards the base of her skull. That's a nightmare scenario for standard radiation.
Yeah, you can just picture all the critical things right there. So how is SPArc different? What's the main benefit?
Precision, extreme precision. Compared to standard proton therapy, like SFO-IMPT, which is mentioned, SPArc drastically reduces the radiation dose to surrounding healthy tissue and organs.
And the numbers in the article are pretty staggering. They talk about, what was it, 10% less dose to the brainstem? That alone sounds huge.
It is huge, but then you see 56% less to the optical chiasm, where your optic nerves cross 72% less to the inside of the mouth, and an incredible 90% less dose to the spinal canal.
90% less to the spine, wow. Dr. Subramaniam in the article calls it definitely significant, which feels like an understatement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially, for head and neck tumors or anything complex near the skull base. Avoiding damage to the brainstem, the optic nerves, the spine, that's critical for the patient's quality of life afterwards. It can prevent really devastating, irreparable side effects.
So how does it work, the step and shoot part? Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. Think of proton beams like tiny, incredibly precise paintbrushes. They have this property called the Bragg peak, meaning they dump most of their energy at a very specific depth and then stop. SPArc uses magnets to rapidly scan this beam, point by point, painting the tumor volume.
Okay, so it scans across the tumor.
Right. And the arc part means the machine rotates around the patient, delivering these painted layers from multiple angles. In the case study, they used 9 different beam angles covering a 180-degree arc.
So hitting it from all sides basically allows them to shape the dose much more accurately around the tumor and away from the healthy stuff.
Precisely. It sculpts the dose in 3D. The source also mentions the practicalities treatment sessions took about 15 to 18 minutes, and they use sophisticated imaging, CBCT scans, converted to synthetic CTs, to track the dose delivery very carefully.
And they even adjusted the plan mid-treatment on day 13 because the patient lost weight, which slightly affected the tumor dose.
Right.
That level of monitoring is intense.
It really shows the level of care needed. But like any advanced tech, it's not without challenges. The source does mention some limitations.
Right. Dr. Subramaniam brings up the geographical miss issue. For very small tumors that might shift slightly between sessions, there's a risk the beam could miss part of it, potentially affecting the cure rate. That's a technical hurdle.
A significant one.
Okay.
And then there's the elephant in the room, cost.
Always costs, isn't it?
Yeah.
This kind of high-tech precision equipment must be incredibly expensive.
It is. And the source points out that this is a significant concern. It means that, for now at least, this potentially life-changing therapy is only accessible to a very small number of patients.
So you have this amazing advancement, but a major barrier to actually getting it to everyone who might benefit. That's a familiar story in cutting-edge healthcare, unfortunately.
It really highlights that tension between innovation and equitable access.
Okay, let's shift gears quite dramatically. From super high-tech medical solutions, our next source takes us to something focused on sustainability and resources, but with a surprisingly almost everyday twist.
Yeah, we're looking at e-waste recycling, specifically getting silver back from discarded electronics. And the proposed method involves, believe it or not, cooking oils.
Cooking oils. Okay, that sounds unexpected. But first, the source really drives home how important silver is beyond just rings and necklaces.
Oh, massively important,
Yeah.
especially in industry and crucially in the energy sector. Think solar panels. The article mentions India generating 108 gigawatts yearly from solar, all using silver.
And then mobile phones. India alone, 1.4 billion users. Each phone has maybe 100, 200 milligrams of silver. Laptops, 50 million in India, 350 milligrams each. The scale is just enormous when you think globally.
It really is. And here's a kicker. We're recovering barely 15% of that silver from waste electrical and electronic equipment, or AEEE. Most of it is just lost.
15%, that seems incredibly low, especially when you factor in the clean energy transition, right? The demand for silver is going to skyrocket.
Absolutely. The source quotes the IEA predicting every other car sold will be electric by 2035. Solar panels, EVs, they all need silver. Demand is expected to increase by something like 170%.
So if we need 170% more, and we're only recovering 15% of what's already out there in waste, that doesn't add up. We're heading for a real crunch.
Exactly. Which makes this new method from Finland potentially very interesting. They found a way to efficiently extract silver using organic fatty acids.
Fatty acids, like the stuff in vegetable oil.
Pretty much. Specifically, things like linolenic and oleic acids found in common cooking oils derived from seeds, nuts, vegetables.
How does that compare to how it's usually done?
Well, traditional methods often use pretty nasty stuff, strong acids, even cyanide. Highly toxic, difficult to handle, bad for the environment. This fatty acid method is presented as much greener.
And recyclable, the source says. And suitable for urban mining, pulling metals out of our electronic junk piles.
That's the potential they see. The researchers are quoted suggesting these fatty acids may therefore become the next generation of media for treating waste containing multiple metals. It's a fascinating example of finding a sustainable solution in a very common substance.
It really is. Sometimes the simplest ideas are the most elegant. Okay, so from mining value here on Earth, let's look upwards towards space and the challenges involved there. Our next source covers the Axiom 4 mission.
Right, the commercial mission to the International Space Station. This one has got quite a bit of attention, especially in India, because astronaut-designate Shubhanshu Shukla is part of the crew.
If the mission goes ahead as planned, he'd be the first Indian citizen in orbit in 40 years, and the first ever on the ISS. A big milestone, and ISRO has invested significantly, around 500 crore, according to the source.
But the mission has hit several snags. It's been postponed multiple times, 4 times, even before the most recent delay announced around Juneteenth.
Some of those earlier delays were kind of standard issues, right? Weather, vehicle checks, that sort of thing.
Yes, the usual suspects in spaceflight. But this latest delay, the critical one, was pinned down to something specific. A leak of liquid oxygen, LOX, discovered during a test of a SpaceX Falcon 9 engine.
LOX? That sounds serious. It's the oxidizer for the fuel, isn't it?
Exactly. It's supercooled cryogenic fuel. A leak means the oxygen, which needs to be liquid to feed the engine properly, is escaping and boiling off into gas. That's obviously not good for engine performance and potentially dangerous.
And finding a leak of something cryogenic must be incredibly difficult. It just
Yes,
evaporates.
Right. Invisibly, pretty much. The source touches on the challenges. LOX flashes instantly to vapor. Plus, the components contract at those extremely low temperatures, so a seal that's fine at room temp might leak when chilled. It's tricky to pinpoint.
How do they even look for it?
They use a whole range of techniques. Visual checks, looking for frost or vapor plumes, bubble tests with soapy water on joints, injecting helium tracer gas and using detectors, thermal imaging cameras. It's a complex process.
And adding to the complexity, the source mentioned another issue flagged around the same time NASA and Roscosmos were tracking some unusual pressure reading on one of the ISS service modules.
Right, so it wasn't just the rocket leak. It really underscores how many different complex systems have to be perfectly greenlit for a mission involving docking with the station to go ahead. Everything has to align.
So launch windows are important too, right? Though maybe less tight for ISS than for, say, Mars?
Generally, yes. The ISS orbit means launch opportunities come around more frequently. But you're still constrained by other factors, the time needed on the launch pad for preparations and checks, and crucially, making sure a docking port is actually available and ready on the ISS when the capsule arrives.
It's a complicated dance. The source did note an update that they were aiming to reattempt the launch around June 19th. Fingers crossed for the crew. It's just another reminder that space travel, even routine-looking ISS missions, is still very much on the edge.
Definitely. Things can go wrong quickly. Which actually brings us nicely to our next source, moving from the complexities of space travel back to the complexities and risks of travel on Earth's oceans global shipping.
Right, this piece looks at recent incidents in India off the Kerala coast. There was a fire on one container ship, the MV Wanhai 503, and another, the MSC ELSA 3, actually sank.
And incidents like these immediately raise alarms about pollution, don't they? Fuel spills, potentially hazardous cargo leaking into the marine environment.
So who's in charge of setting the rules for all this? The source mentions the IMO, the International Maritime Organization.
That's the one. It's a UN agency, and its conventions, once ratified, become part of the national law of member countries. India is a signatory to many key conventions.
But interestingly, the source points out India hasn't signed the HNS Convention, which deals specifically with liability and compensation for damage from hazardous and noxious substances spills. Seems relevant given these incidents.
It does seem particularly relevant, yeah. So when something does go wrong, a sinking, a major fire, cargo loss, who pays, who is responsible?
The source is clear. Primarily, it's the ship owner who is liable.
And the key document there is the bill of lading. That's the contract, essentially proving who owns the cargo being shipped. It gets transferred from the exporter to the importer, and the ship owner is liable to whoever holds that bill if the cargo is lost or damaged.
Okay, and then there's insurance. The article mentions something called a P&I club. What's that?
It's a bit unusual. Not like your standard insurance policy. P&I stands for Protection and Indemnity. It's basically a mutual insurance association where ship owners pool their resources to cover liability claims against them.
Claims against them, so not for damage to their own ship.
Exactly. P&I covers things like liability for environmental damage, oil spills, hazardous substance spills, loss of cargo belonging to others, or even loss of life or injury claims. Standard hull insurance covers damage to the ship itself. P&I covers the consequences for others.
Got it. And what about limits on liability? Can owners just cap their losses?
It's complicated. International conventions often do cap the owner's liability for cargo loss. But, and this is crucial, they generally don't cap liability for environmental pollution damage from oil or hazardous substances. The polluter pays principle is meant to apply quite strongly there.
Although national laws can sometimes impose their own limits, the source notes. What about cleaning up the mess, the salvage?
That responsibility also falls squarely on the ship owner. Within a country's sovereign waters, which extend up to 200 nautical miles, salvage operations are governed by agreements like the Nairobi Convention, which India has signed.
It's a complex web of responsibility and liability. But why do these accidents still happen so often, despite all the rules and technology?
The source offers an interesting perspective. It's not always just faulty materials or lack of skill. It mentions the vagaries of the sea, of course, but often points to a series of errors, multiple small things going wrong that unfortunately align to cause a disaster.
And sometimes human factors play a big role. The example given of ships sailing too close to shore, sometimes just to get a mobile signal, which led to the Wakashio grounding off Mauritius. That's pretty shocking.
It shows how seemingly minor decisions can have catastrophic consequences in such a high-stakes environment. But the industry does try to learn, albeit often reactively.
Like the Titanic disaster leading to the SOLAS Convention, which mandated enough lifeboats for everyone on board stowed on one side of the ship.
Exactly. Major accidents force revisions and improvements to safety regulations. It's a continuous, if sometimes tragic, learning curve.
Okay, from navigating maritime law and safety, let's turn inward, to navigating legal and healthcare systems here on land, focusing on a critical issue in India.
This next source discusses recent guidelines issued by the Delhi High Court. They're aimed at making things smoother and faster for sexual assault survivors who need to access medical termination of pregnancy, or MTP.
And these guidelines came about because of a specific, very troubling case, didn't they? Involving a minor survivor at Amy's hospital.
Yes, sadly. The source details how she faced significant delays. There was confusion over identity documents, procedural holdups involving the Child Welfare Committee, and even a miscommunication about her pregnancy's gestational age.
Right. Initially, they thought she was past 24 weeks, which requires a court order for termination in India, but then it turned out she was under 24 weeks, meaning she shouldn't have needed the court order in the first place. But the delay caused huge problems.
Precisely. It highlighted critical failures in the system. So the High Court stepped in with very specific directives for hospitals.
What are the key ones?
They're quite direct. Hospitals are told, don't demand separate ID proof if the police provide the case file or FIR for the survivor. Don't automatically apply rigid routine checks meant for adults to minors in these situations. Perform comprehensive medical exams without delay as soon as a pregnant survivor presents.
And crucially,
Crucially, if the pregnancy appears to be over 24 weeks based on initial assessment, the hospital must constitute a medical board immediately to evaluate the case for MTP. They shouldn't wait for a court order before forming the board.
that seems vital for preventing those kinds of delays that happen in the Ames case. Get the medical evaluation done promptly, regardless of the exact week count initially.
Exactly. The guidelines also mandate hospitals to keep updated standard operating procedures and legal guidelines easily accessible, regularly brief, and sensitize their doctors, especially those on duty, about the MTP Act, the POCSO Act for child survivors, and relevant court orders.
Training is key, too.
Yes, quarterly training involving legal aid services and designating a specific nodal officer to handle and coordinate MTP cases. It's about building expertise and clear responsibility within the hospital.
And the police weren't left out either. The court directed mandatory training for Delhi police officers every 6 months on these procedures and ensuring they get survivors and their case files to the doctors or medical boards without delay.
The source also reminds us of some earlier guidelines, like ensuring child welfare committees notify legal aid services promptly for minor cases over 24 weeks and mandating pregnancy tests and same-day medical board referrals for adult survivors seeking termination.
So, taken together, what's the big picture here?
It's really about the High Court trying to systematically remove the barriers, the administrative hurdles, the points of confusion, the potential for delay that can compound the trauma for survivors and prevent them from accessing timely, sensitive, and legally entitled medical care. It's about making the system work for the survivor, not against them.
A really important set of changes. Okay. Moving from those critical social and legal issues, let's pivot to our section on people and perspectives. First up, a deep dive into a major global figure.
Yes, this source focuses on Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who's been Iran's supreme leader since 1989. The article frames his current situation as possibly the greatest test of his long rule.
It gives some background on his life, which is pretty intense. Enduring torture under the Shah, surviving a bomb attack in 1981 that partially paralyzed his arm, rising alongside Ayatollah Khamenei after the revolution.
Yeah, it paints a picture of someone shaped by significant struggle, who then built this theocratic system centered around his authority and the principle of vilayat-e-faqih, or guardianship of the jurist.
But the source makes it clear his rule has faced constant challenges. Economic problems have been persistent, worsened by sanctions, leading to hyperinflation and stifled growth.
And politically, there have been major tensions. The article mentions him siding with hardliners against reformist President Khamenei back in '97 and numerous crackdowns on protests over the years, alongside various security crises.
He did greenlight the nuclear talks with the U.S. under President Rouhani, leading to the 2015 deal JCPOA.
He did. But then, as the source notes, President Trump pulling the U.S. out in 2018 really plunged Iran back into severe economic crisis, fueling more frequent and widespread uprisings.
So what constitutes this greatest test right now, according to the article?
It points to a combination of factors, but particularly highlights recent regional dynamics and security incidents. It mentions the reported Israeli attacks inside Iran around June 13th, supposedly targeting nuclear and missile sites and assassinating commanders.
This was framed as following Israeli actions against Iran's allies or proxies in places like Gaza, Lebanon with Hezbollah, and Syria.
Right. The analysis in the source suggests that despite Iran launching its own retaliatory strike against Israel earlier, Khamenei is now in a very difficult position, facing few good options.
Why few good options?
The article suggests Iran's conventional defenses might be vulnerable, its regional axis of resistance seems to be weakened or rolled back, and the international political climate, especially with figures like Trump potentially returning or Netanyahu in power, is unfavorable.
So the core challenge, as the source puts it, is for Khamenei to simultaneously protect the regime and protect the nation under these intense internal and external pressures. And again, just to be clear for everyone listening, we're relaying the analysis presented in this particular source material, not taking a political stance ourselves.
Absolutely. Now let's make a sharp turn from the high stakes of geopolitics to the perhaps equally intense inner world of language, art, and identity. Our next profile is of the writer Jhumpa Lahiri.
Ah, yes, the Pulitzer Prize winner. She's known for constantly reinventing herself as a writer, isn't she?
Very much so. And the source catches her in the middle of what she describes as her most demanding project ever, translating Ovid's ancient Latin epic, the Metamorphoses.
Ovid's Metamorphoses. That's a monumental work, all about transformation.
And she explicitly connects with that theme. She loves the book, she says, because change serves as a plot, which, as the source points out, mirrors her own artistic journey.
From being celebrated as an American author writing about the immigrant experience to making a conscious decision to write primarily in Italian, a language she learned later in life, and now immersing herself in translating ancient Latin. It's quite a trajectory.
The interviewer notes their own similar journey of linguistic shift, creating a nice parallel. But a key point Lahiri makes, and seems quite passionate about, is highlighting what she calls exophonic women writers.
Exophonic, meaning?
Writers who choose to create literature in a language that isn't their first or mother tongue. Lahiri feels the conversation about this phenomenon has focused too much on famous male examples like Nabokov or Beckett.
And she wants to bring more attention to women who've done the same.
Exactly. She gives examples like Etel Adnan, the Lebanese poet who wrote powerfully in English and French and was also a publisher supporting experimental writing by women, and Rosemarie Waldrop, German-born, who writes celebrated poetry in English and uses her extensive translation work from French and German to feed her own creative process.
That's a fascinating perspective. What does she say about her own relationship with language?
She dislikes the term native language. She talks about the importance of freedom to write in the language we love, implying it's a choice, an affinity, not just an accident of birth. And she describes translation itself as an act of love.
An act of love, that's a beautiful way to put it. Does she offer any advice for writers?
She does, based on her own practice. She encourages young writers to translate works they admire and also to consciously practice writing like authors they love, imitating their style, their structure.
Some might see that as derivative, but she frames it differently.
Completely. She sees it not as lacking originality, but as a vital way of connecting with literary history, of keeping the past alive, almost like speaking to the dead. It's about learning through deep engagement.
A really thoughtful take on the writing process. Okay, let's stay in the literary world for our final source, which introduces a new indie novel that uses some very unusual techniques.
Yes, this is a novel called Ajita by K. Sridhar. And what makes it stand out, according to the source, is its use of methods inspired by the French literary group Oulipo.
Oulipo, Workshop of Potential Literature. I've heard of them. They're known for using constraints, right? Like mathematical formulas or strict rules to write.
Exactly. The paradox is that they believe these tight constraints can actually liberate creativity, forcing the writer into unexpected territory. Famous examples mentioned are Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, or Raymond Queneau's Exercises in Style, which tells the same trivial story in 99 different ways.
So how does Ajita use Olympian constraints?
It employs a pretty challenging one. The novel is structured in 26 sections, corresponding to the letters of the alphabet, and each chapter is written without using that specific letter.
Wow, so a chapter without any ease. A chapter without any ease. That sounds incredibly difficult to pull off while telling a coherent story.
Extremely difficult. The source calls the experimentation rigorous and fresh. The novel itself weaves together two main narrative threads from different eras.
Who are the characters?
There's Ajita, who is described as a Carvaka philosopher from the 5th century BCE, part of an ancient Indian materialist school of thought. And then there's Moksh, a Marxist academic living and working in Mumbai in the 20th century.
So two very different perspectives, exploring big ideas across centuries.
Yes, the scope seems quite ambitious. Through their inner lives and encounters with figures ranging from Vedic philosophers and the Buddha in Ajita's time to Dalit panthers and trade union activists in Moksh's manuals, the novel tackles questions about ritual, ethics, life, death, and politics.
It sounds fascinating conceptually. Does the source offer any critique? Does the constraint perhaps overshadow the story?
It does acknowledge some potential drawbacks. While praising the formal rigor, the reviewer mentions that the characters can sometimes feel a bit two-dimensional, perhaps serving the conceptual framework more than developing deep inner lives. It also notes the novel barely passes the Bechdel test, suggesting female characters might primarily exist to advance the plots of the male protagonists.
Okay, so some reservations about character depth and representation.
Yes, but despite those critiques, the overall assessment seems positive, particularly regarding its innovation. It's lauded for its freshness and how the novel's structure of the constraint itself almost becomes a character, reflecting its theme of resisting orthodoxy in Indian society.
So it's seen as pushing boundaries for Indian fiction.
That's the sense. The source suggests it offers a refreshing new direction in conversation, even comparing its exploration of inner consciousness through form to Doris Lessing's inner space fiction. It's a challenging but potentially rewarding read for those interested in literary experimentation.
That's a great place to wrap up our sources for today. Looking back across this diverse stack, it's really striking how certain themes seem to pop up in unexpected places.
Absolutely. That idea of constraints, for instance, we saw it literally in the Oulipo novel, using rules to shape creativity.
But also in the SPArc cancer therapy, the constraint of needing extreme precision to avoid damaging healthy tissue drives the complex engineering.
And in the e-waste recycling, the constraint of limited resources and the need for sustainable methods pushes researchers towards innovative, greener solutions like using fatty acids.
Then there were the constraints of physics and logistics and space travel with Axiom 4, and the regulatory constraints and sometimes failures governing safety in global shipping.
We saw the legal system trying to remove procedural constraints that harm survivors in the MTP guidelines. And then the immense political and economic constraints pressing down on Ayatollah Khamenei.
Even Jhumpa Lahiri's discussion of choosing a language, embracing the constraint of a non-native tongue as a path to freedom and love.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Constraints aren't always just negative limitations. Sometimes they define the problem in a way that forces a breakthrough.
Right. They can be the friction that sparks innovation, or the framework that reveals deeper truths, or the pressure that necessitates essential change.
Exactly. So, a final thought for you to consider. What other areas of life, maybe your own work or hobbies, actually benefit from having certain limits, rules, or specific structures imposed on them? Where do constraints lead to better outcomes?
Thank you for listening. If today's episode gave you something useful, consider following us on Spotify so you're the first to hear the next one.
You can give suggestions by contacting on Twitter handle given in the episode description. We're always eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about.
We wish you a great day.